It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis, Chapter 24. He could not decide whether Emil Staubmeyer, and through him Shad Ledoux, knew that he had tried to escape. Did Staubmeyer really look more knowing, or did he just imagine it? What the deuce had Emil meant when he said, "I hear the roads aren't so good up north, not so good"? Whether they knew or not, it was grinding that he should have to shiver, lest an illiterate roustabout like Shad Ledoux find out that he desired to go to Canada, while a rule slapper like Staubmeyer, a squeers with certificates in pedagogy, should now be able to cuff grown men instead of urchins, and should be editor of the Informer. Doremus's Informer. Staubmeyer, that human blackboard. Daily, Doremus found it more cramping, more instantly stirring to fury to write anything mentioning Windrip. His private office, the cheerfully rattling linotype room, the shouting press room with its smell of ink that to him hitherto had been like the smell of grease paint to an actor, they were hateful now and choking. Not even Lorinda's faith, not even Sissy's jibes and Buck's stories could rouse him to hope. He rejoiced the more, therefore, when his son, Philip, telephoned him from Worcester. "Be home Sunday? Marilla's in New York, gadding, and I'm here all alone. Thought I'd just drive up the day and see how things are in your neck of the woods." "Come on! Splendid! So long since we've seen you. I'll have your mother start a pot of beans right away." Doremus was happy. Not for some time did his cursed two-way mindedness come to weaken his joy, as he wondered whether it was just a myth held over from boyhood that Philip really cared so much for Emma's beans and brown bread, and wondered just why it was that up-to-date Americans like Philip always used the long-distance telephone, rather than undergo the dreadful toil of dictating a letter a day or two earlier. It didn't really seem so efficient, the old-fashioned village editor reflected, to spend 75 cents on a telephone call in order to save 5 cents worth of time. "Oh, hush, anyway. I'll be delighted to see the boy. I'll bet there isn't a smarter young lawyer in Worcester. There's one member of the family that's a real success." He was a little shocked when Philip came, like a one-man procession, into the living room late on Saturday afternoon. He'd been forgetting how bald his upstanding young advocate was growing even at 34. And it seemed to him that Philip was a little heavy and senatorial in speech and a bit too cordial. "By Joe, Dad, you don't know how good it is to be back in the old digs. Mother and the girls upstairs? By Jove, sir, that was a horrible business, the killing of poor Fowler. Horrible. I was simply horrified. There must have been a mistake somewhere, because Judge Swan has a wonderful reputation for scrupulousness." "There was no mistake. Swan is a fiend, literally." Dormish sounded less paternal than when he had first bounded up to shake hands with the beloved prodigal. "Really? We must talk it over. I'll see if there can't be a stricter investigation. Swan? Really? Well, certainly. We'll go into the whole business. But first I must just skip upstairs and give Mammy a good smack and Marion little Sis." And that was the last time Philip mentioned Effingham Swan or any stricter investigation of the acts thereof. All afternoon he was relentlessly filial and fraternal, and he smiled like an automobile salesman when Sissy griped at him. "What's the idea of all the tender hand-dusting, Philco?" Doremus and he were not alone till nearly midnight. They sat upstairs in the sacred study. Philip lighted one of Doremus's excellent cigars as though he were a cinema actor playing the role of a man lighting an excellent cigar, and breathed amiably. "Well, sir, this is an excellent cigar. It certainly is excellent." "Why not?" "Oh, I was just appreciating it, and—" "What is it, Phil? There's something on your mind. Shoot. Not rowing with Marilla, are you?" "Certainly not. Most certainly not. Oh, I don't approve of everything Mary does. She's a little extravagant, but she's got a heart of gold. And let me tell you, Potter, there isn't a young woman in society in Worcester that makes a nicer impression on everybody, especially at nice dinner parties." "Well, then, let's have it, Phil. Something serious?" "Yes, I'm afraid there is. Look, Dad." "Oh, do sit down and be comfortable. I've been awfully perturbed to hear that that you're in a slightly bad odor with some of the authorities. You mean the corpos? Naturally, who else? Maybe I don't recognize them as the authorities. Oh, listen, Potter, please don't joke tonight. I'm serious. As a matter of fact, I hear you're more than just slightly in the wrong with them. And who may your informant be? Oh, just letters, old school friends. Now, you aren't really pro-corpo, are you? How'd you ever guess? Well, I didn't vote for Windrip, personally. But I begin to see where I was wrong. I can now see that it's not only great personal magnetism, but real constructive power, real, sure enough statesmanship. Some say it's Lee Saracen's doing, but don't you believe it for a minute. Look at all that Buzz did back in his home state before he ever teamed up with Saracen. And some say Windrip is crude. Well, so were Lincoln and Jackson. Not what I think of Windrip. The only thing you ought to think of Windrip is that his gangsters murdered your fine brother-in-law, and plenty of other men just as good. Do you condone such murders? No, certainly not. How could you suggest such a thing, Dad? No one abhors violence more than I do. Still, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. Hell and damnation! Why Potter? Don't call me Potter. If I ever hear that can make an omelet phrase again, I'll start doing a little murder myself. It's used to justify every atrocity under every despotism. Fascism or Nazi or communist or American labor war, omelet, eggs, by God. Sir, men's souls and blood are not eggshells for tyrants to break. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I guess maybe the phrase is a little shop-worn. I just mean to say that I'm just trying to figure out the situation out realistically. Realistically? That's another buttered bun to excuse murdered. But honestly, horrible things do happen, thanks to the imperfection of human nature, but you can forgive the means if the end is a rejuvenated nation. That I can do nothing of the kind. I can never forgive evil and lying and cruel means, and still less can I forgive fanatics that use that for an excuse. If I may imitate Romain Roland, a country that tolerates evil means, evil manners, standards of ethics, for a generation will be so poisoned that it never will have any good end. I'm not just curious. But do you know how perfectly you're quoting every Bolshevik apologist that sneers at decency and kindness and truthfulness in daily dealings as bourgeois morality? I hadn't understood that you'd gone quite so Marxo-materialistic. I? Marxian? Good God! Dreamus was pleased to see that he had stirred his son out of his "if your honor please" smugness. Well, one of the things I most admire about the corpos is that, as I know absolutely, I have reliable information from Washington. They have saved us from a simply ghastly invasion by red agents of Moscow, communists pretending to be decent labor leaders. Not really. Had the fool forgotten that his father was a newspaperman and not likely to be impressed by reliable information from Washington? Really, and to be realistic, sorry, sir, if you don't like that word, but to be realistic. Well, yes then. Dreamus recalled such tempers in Philip from years ago. Had he been wise, after all, to restrain himself from the domestic pleasure of licking the brat? The whole point is that Windrip, or anyway the corpos, are here to stay, Potter. And we've got to base our future actions not on some desired utopia, but on what we really and truly have. And think of what they've actually done. Just, for example, how they removed the advertising billboards from the highways and ended unemployment, and their simply stupendous feat in getting rid of all crime. Good God! Pardon me, what do you say, Dad? Nothing, go on. But I begin to see now that the corpo gains haven't been just material, but spiritual. Huh? Really, they've revitalized the whole country. Formerly, it had gotten pretty sordid, just thinking about material possessions and comforts, about electric refrigeration and television and air conditioning. Kind of lost the sturdiness that characterized our pioneer ancestors. Why, ever so many young men were refusing to take military drill, and the discipline and willpower and good fellowship that you only get from military training. Oh, pardon me, I forgot you were pacifist, Dreamus grimly muttered. Not anymore. Of course, There must be any number of things we can't agree on, Dad, but after all, as a publicist, you ought to listen to the voice of youth. You, youth? You're not youth. You're 2,000 years old mentally. You date just about 100 BC in your fine new imperialistic theories. No, but you must listen, Dad. Why do you suppose I came clear up here from Worcester just to see you? God only knows. I want to make myself clear. Before Winthrop, we'd been lying down in America while Europe was throwing off all her bonds, both monarchy and this antiquated parliamentary democratic liberal system that really means rule by professional politicians and by egoistic intellectuals. We've got to catch up to Europe again. Got to expand. It's the rule of life. A nation, like a man, has to go ahead or go backwards, always. I know, Phil. I used to write that same thing in the same words back before 1914. Did you? Well, anyway, gotta expand. Why, what we ought to do is to grab all of Mexico and maybe Central America and a good big slice of China. Why, just on their own behalf, we ought to do it, misgoverned the way they are. Maybe I'm wrong, but impossible. Winthrop and Saracen and Dewey Hake and McGoblin, all those fellows, they're big. They're making me stop and think. And now, to come to an end to my errand here. You think I ought to run the Informer according to Corpo theology? Why, yes! That was approximately what I was going to say. I just don't see why you haven't been more reasonable about this whole thing, with your quick mind. After all, the time for selfish individualism is gone. We've got to have mass action. One for all and all for one. Philip, would you mind telling me what the deuce you're really heading toward? Cut the cackle. Well, since you insist to cut the cackle, as you call it, not very politely, seems to me, seeing I've taken the trouble to come up here clear from Worcester, that I have reliable information that you're going to get into mighty serious trouble if you don't stop opposing, or at least markedly failing to support the government. All right, what of it? It's my serious trouble. That's just the point, it isn't. I do think that just for once in your life you might think of Mother and the girls instead of always your own selfish ideas that you're so proud of. In a crisis like this, it's just isn't funny any longer to pose as a quaint liberal. Doremus's voice was like a firecracker. Cut the cackle, I told you. What you after? What's the Corpo gang to you? I've been approached in regard to a very high honor of an assistant military judgeship, but your attitude as my father... Philip, I'd rather think that I give you my parental curse, not so much because you are a traitor as because you have become a stuffed shirt. Good night. End of chapter 24. It Can't Happen Here by Sinclair Lewis, chapter 25. Holidays were invented by the devil to coax people into the heresy that happiness can be won by taking thought. What was planned as a rackety day for David's first Christmas with his grandparents was, they saw too well, perhaps David's last Christmas with them. Mary had hidden her weeping, but the day before Christmas, when Shad Ledoux tramped into command of Doremus, whether Karl Pascal had ever spoken to him of communism, Mary came on Shad in the hall, stared at him, raised her hand like a boxing cat, and said with a dreadful quietness, "You murderer! I shall kill you and kill Swan." For once, Shad did not look amused. To make the holiday as good an imitation of mirth as possible, they were very noisy, but their holly, their tinsel stars on a tall pine tree, their family devotion in serene old house in a little town was no different at heart from the despairing drunkenness in the city night. Doremus reflected that it might have been just as well for all of them to get drunk and let themselves go, elbows on slopped cafe tables, as to toil at this pretense of domestic bliss. He now had another thing for which to hate the Corpos, for stealing the secure affection of Christmas. For noon dinner, Louis Rottenstern was invited because he was a lorn bachelor, and still more because he was a Jew, now insecure and snubbed and threatened in an insane dictatorship. There is no greater compliment to the Jews than the fact that the degree of their unpopularity is always the scientific measure of the cruelty and silliness of the regime under which they live, so that even a commercial-minded, money-fondling, heavily humorous Jew burgher like Rottenstern is still a sensitive meter of barbarism. After dinner came Buck Titus, David's most favorite person, bearing staggering amounts of Woolworth tractors and fire engines and a real bow and arrow, and he was raucously insisting that Mrs. Candy dance with him what he not very precisely called the light fantastic, when the hammering sounded at the door. Harris Dilly tramped in with 4 men. "Looking for Rottenstern." "Oh, that you, Louis? Get your coat on and come on. Orders." "What's the idea? What you want with him? What's the charge?" demanded Buck, still standing with his arm about Mrs. Candy's embarrassed waist. "Dunno if there be any charges, just ordered to headquarters for questioning. District Commissioner Reek in town, just asking a few people a few questions. Come on, you." The hilarious celebrants did not, as they had planned, go out to Lorinda's tavern for skiing. Next day they heard that Rottenstern had been taken to the concentration camp at Trianon, along with that crabbed old Tory Raymond Pridewell, the hardware dealer. Both imprisonments were incredible. Rottenstern had been too meek, and if Pridewell had not ever been meek, if he had constantly and testily and loudly proclaimed that he had not cared for Ledoux as a hired man and now cared even less for him as a local governor, yet, why, Pridewell was a sacred institution, as well as think of dragging the Brownstone Baptist Church to prison. Later, a friend of Shad Ledoux took over Rottenstern's shop. "It can happen here," meditated Doremus. "It could happen to him. How soon?" Before he should be arrested, he must make amends to his conscience by quitting the Informer. Professor Victor Loveland, once a classicist of Isaiah College, having been fired from a labor camp for incompetence in teaching arithmetic to lumberjacks, was in town with wife and babies on his way to a job clerking in his uncle's slate quarry near Fairhaven. He called on Doremus and was hysterically cheerful. He called on Clarence Little, dropped in to visit him, Clarence would have said, now that the twitchy, intense jeweler Clarence, who had been born on a Vermont farm and had supported his mother till she died when he was 30, had longed to go to college and especially to study Greek. Though Loveland was his own age, in the mid-30s, he looked on him as a combination of Keats and Liddell. His greatest moment had been hearing Loveland read Homer. Loveland was leaning on the counter. "Gone ahead with your grammar, Clarence?" "Golly, Professor, I just don't seem's worthwhile anymore. I guess I'm kind of a weak sister anyway, but I find that these days it's all about I can do to keep going." "Me too. And don't call me Professor. I'm a timekeeper in a slate quarry. What a life." They had not noticed the clumsy-looking man in plain clothes who had just come in. Presumably he was a customer, but he grumbled, "So you two pansies don't like the way things go nowadays? Don't suppose you like the corpos, don't think much of the chief?" He jabbed his thumb into Loveland's ribs so painfully that Loveland yelped. "I don't think about him at all." "Oh, you don't, eh? Well, you two fairies can come along to the courthouse with me." "And who may you be?" "Oh, just an ensign in the MMs, that's all." He had an automatic pistol. Loveland was not beaten much because he managed to keep his mouth shut, but Little was so hysterical that they laid him on the kitchen table and decorated his naked back with 40 slashes of a steel ramrod. They had found that Clarence wore yellow silk underwear, and the MMs from Factory and Plowland laughed, particularly one broad young inspector who was rumored to have had a passionate friendship with a battalion leader from Nashua who was fat, eyeglassed, and high-pitched of voice. Little had to be helped into the truck that took Loveland and him to the Trianon concentration camp. One eye was closed and so surrounded with bruised flesh that the MM driver said it looked like a Spanish omelet. The truck had an open body, but they could not escape because the 3 prisoners on this trip were chained hand to hand. They lay on the floor of the truck. It was snowing. The 3rd prisoner was not much like Loveland or Little. His name was Ben Tipper. He had been a mill hand from Derry Coal. He cared no more about the Greek language than he did a baboon, but he did care for 6 children. He had been arrested for trying to strike coal and for cursing the Corpo regime when coal had reduced his wages from $9 a week in pre-Corpo currency to $7.50. As to Loveland's wife and babies, Lorinda took them in till she could pass the hat and collect enough to send them back to Mrs. Loveland's family on a rocky farm in Missouri. But then things went better. Mrs. Loveland was favored by the Greek proprietor of a lunchroom and got work washing dishes and otherwise pleasing the proprietor, who brilliantined his mustache. The county administration, in a proclamation signed by Emil Staubmeyer, announced that they were going to regulate the agriculture on the submarginal land high up on Mount Terror. As a starter, 6 of the poorer families were moved into the large, square, quiet old house of that large, square, quiet old farmer, Henry Veeder, cousin of Dreamus Jessup. These poorer families had many children, a great many, so that there were 4 or 5 persons bedded on the floor in every room of the home where Henry and his wife had placidly lived alone since their own children had grown. Henry did not like it, and said so, not very tactically, to the MMs herding the refugees. What was worse, the dispossessed did not like it any better. "'Tain't much, but we've got a house of our own. Don't know why we should get shoved in on Henry," said one. "Don't expect other folks to bother me, and don't expect to bother other folks. Never did like that fool kind of yellow color Henry painted his barn, but I guess that's his business." So Henry and 2 of the regulated agriculturists were taken to the Trianon concentration camp, and the rest remained in Henry's house, doing nothing but finish up Henry's large larder and wait for orders. "And before I'm sent to join Henry and Carl and Loveland, I'm going to clear my skirts," Dreamus vowed, along in late January. He marched to see County Commissioner Ledoux. "I want to quit the Informer. Staubmeyer has learned all I can teach him." "Staubmeyer? Oh, you mean Assistant Commissioner Staubmeyer?" "Chuck it, will you? We're not on parole, and we're not playing soldiers. Mind if I sit down?" "Don't look like you cared a hell of a lot whether I mind or not, but I can tell you right here and now, Jessup, without any monkey business about it, you're not going to leave your job. I guess I could find enough grounds for sending you to Trianon for about 1,000,000 years with 90 lashes, but you've always been so stuck on yourself as such a all-fired honest editor, it kind of tickles me to watch you kissing the chief's foot in mine. I'll do it no more, that's certain. And I admit I deserve your scorn for ever having done it." "Well, isn't that elegant? But you'll just do what I tell you, and like it, Jessup. I suppose you think I had a swell time when I was your hired man, watching you and your old woman and girls go off on a picnic while I was just your hired man with dirt on my ears. You're dirt. I could stay home and clean up the basement." "Maybe we didn't want you along, Shad. Good morning." Shad laughed. There was a sound of the gates of Trianon concentration camp in that laughter. It was really Sissy who gave Dreamus his lead. He drove to Hanover to see Shad's superior, District Commissioner John Sullivan Reek, that erstwhile jovial and red-faced politician. He was admitted after only half an hour's waiting. He was shocked to see how pale and hesitant and frightened Reek had become, but the commissioner tried to be authoritative. "Well, Jessup, what can I do for you? May I be frank?" What? Well, why, certainly. Frankness has always been my middle name." "I hope so, Governor. I find I'm of no use on the Informer at Fort Beulah. As you probably know, I've been breaking in Emil Staubmeyer as my successor. Well, he's quite competent to take hold now, and I want to quit. I'm really just in his way." "Why don't you stick around and see what you can still do to help him? There'll be little jobs cropping up from time to time." "Because it's got on my nerves to take orders where I used to give them for so many years. You can appreciate that, can't you?" "My God, can I appreciate it, and how? Well, I'll think it over. You wouldn't mind writing little pieces for my own little sheet at home. I own part of a paper there. No, sure, delighted. Does this mean that Reek believes the corpo tyranny is going to blow up in a revolution so that he's beginning to trim? Or just that he's fighting to keep from being thrown out? Yes, I can see how you might feel, Brother Jessup. Thanks. Would you mind giving me a note to County Commissioner Ledoux, telling him to let me out without prejudice? Making it pretty strong? No, not a bit. Just wait a minute, old fellow. I'll write it now. Dreamus made as little ceremony as possible of leaving the Informer, which had been his throne for 37 years. Staubmeyer was patronizing. Doc Itchett looked quizzical, but the chapel, headed by Dan Wilgus, shook hands profusely. And so, at 62, stronger and more eager than he had been in all his life, Dreamus had nothing to do more important than eating breakfast and telling his grandson stories about the elephant. But that lasted less than a week. Avoiding suspicion from Emma and Sissy, and even from Buck and Lorinda, he took Julian aside. Look here, boy. I think it's time now for me to begin doing a little high treason. Heaven's sake, keep all of this under your hat. Don't even tip off Sissy. I guess you know the communists are too theocratic for my tastes, but looks to me as though they have more courage and devotion and smart strategy than anybody since the early Christian martyrs, whom they also resemble in hairiness and fondness for catacombs. I want to get in touch with them and see if there's any dirty work at the crossroads I can do for them, say distributing a few early Christian tracts by St. Lenin. But of course, theoretically, the communists have all been in prison. Could you get to Carl Pascal and Trianon and find out whom I should see? Said Julian, I think I could. Dr. Olmsted gets called in there sometimes on cases. They hate him because he hates them, but still, their camp doctor's a drunken bum, and they have to have a real doc in when one of their warders busts his wrist beating up some prisoner. I'll try, sir. 2 days afterward, Julian returned. My God, what a sewer that Trianon place is. I waited for Olmsted before in the car, but I never had the nerve to butt inside. The buildings, they were nice buildings, quite pretty when the girls' school had them. Now the fittings are all torn out, and they've put up wallboard partitions for cells, and the whole place stinks of carbolic acid and excrement. And the air, there isn't any. You feel as though you were nailed up in a box. I don't know how anybody lives in one of those cells for an hour, and yet there's 6 men bunked in a cell 12 feet by 10, with a ceiling only 7 feet high and no light except a 25-watt. I guess it is, bulb in the ceiling. You couldn't read by it. But they get out for exercise 2 hours a day, walk around and around the courtyard. They're all so stooped, and they look so ashamed, as if they'd had the defiance just licked out of them. Even Carl a little. And you remember how proud and sort of sardonic he was. Well, I got to see him, and he says to get in touch with this man. Here, I wrote it down, and for God's sake, burn it up as soon as you've memorized it. Oh yes, they've beaten him all right. He wouldn't talk about it, but there was a scar right across his cheek from his temple right down to his chin. And I had just a glimpse of Henry Veeder. Remember how he looked like an oak tree? Now he twitches all the time, and jumps and gasps when he hears a sudden sound. He didn't know me. I don't think he'd know anybody. Dreamus announced to his family, and told it loudly in Gath, that he was still looking for an option on an apple orchard to which he might retire, and he journeyed southward with pajamas and a toothbrush and the first volume of Spengler's Decline of the West in a briefcase. The address given by Carl Pascal was that of a most gentlemanly dealer in altar cloths and priestly robes, who had his shop and office over a tea-room in Hartford, Connecticut. He talked about the cembalo and the Spinetta de Serenata and the music of Palestrina for an hour before he sent Dreamus on to a busy engineer constructing a dam in New Hampshire, who sent him to a tailor in a side street shop in Lynn, who at last sent him to northern Connecticut and to the eastern headquarters of what was left of the communists in America. Still carrying his little briefcase, he walked up a greasy hill, impassable to any motor car, and knocked at a faded green door of a squat New England farm cottage masked in wintry old lilac bushes and spirea shrubs. A stringy farm wife opened and looked hostile. "I'd like to speak to Mr. Ailey, Mr. Bailey, or Mr. Cayley." "None of 'em are home. You'll have to come again." "Then I'll wait. What else should I do these days?" "All right, come in." "Thanks. Give him this letter." The tailor had warned him. "It will all sound very foolish, the passwords and everything, but if any of the Central Committee gets caught..." He made a squirting sound and drew scissors across his throat. Dreamus sat now in a tiny hall off a flight of stairs, steep as the side of a roof. A hall with sprigged wallpaper and Currier and Ives prints and black-painted wooden rocking chairs with calico cushions. There was nothing to read but a Methodist hymnal and a desk dictionary. He knew the former by heart, and anyway, he always loved reading dictionary. Often had one seduced him from editorial writing. Happily, he sat conning. Phenyl, noun, chemistry. The universal radical C6H5, regarded as the basis of numerous benzene derivatives as phenyl hydroxide C6H5OH. Ferrocraton, noun, a choriambic trimeter catalytic or catalytic glyconic composed of a spondy, a choriambus, and a catalytic syllable. "Well, I never knew any of that before. I wonder if I do now," thought Dreamus contentedly, before he realized that glowering from a very narrow doorway was a very broad man with wild gray hair and a patch over one eye. Dreamus recognized him from pictures. He was Bill Atterbury, miner, longshoreman, veteran, IWW leader, old AFL strike leader, 5 years in San Quentin, 5 honored years in Moscow, and reputed now to be the secretary of the illegal Communist Party. "I'm Mr. Ailey. What can I do for you?" Bill demanded. He led Dreamus into a musty back room where, at a table which was probably mahogany underneath the scars and clots of dirt, sat a squat man with kinky towel-colored hair and with deep wrinkles in the thick, pale skin of his face, and a slender young elegant who suggested Park Avenue. "How are you?" said Mr. Bailey in a Russian Jewish accent. Of him, Dreamus knew nothing save that he was not named Bailey. "Morning," snapped Mr. Cayley, whose name was Elfrey, if Dreamus guessed rightly, and who was the son of a millionaire private banker, the brother of one explorer, one bishop's wife, and one countess, and himself a former teacher of economics in the University of California. Dreamus tried to explain himself to these hard-eyed, quick-glancing plotters of ruin. "Are you willing to become a party member in the extremely implorable case that they accept you, and to take orders, any orders, without question?" asked Elfrey, so suavely. "Do you mean, am I willing to kill and steal?" "You've been reading detective stories about the Reds. No! What you'd have to do would be much more difficult than the amusement of using a Tommy gun. Would you be willing to forget you were ever a respectable newspaper editor giving orders and walk through the snow dressed like a bum to distribute seditious pamphlets, even if, personally, you should believe the pamphlets were of the no slightest damn good to the cause?" "Why, I don't know. It seems to me that as a newspaper man of quite a little training..." "Hell, our only trouble is keeping out the trained newspaper men. What we need is trained bill posters that like the smell of flour paste and hate sleeping. But you're a little old for this crazy fanatics that go out and start strikes. You'll get being up and thrown in the bullpen." "No, I guess Look here, I'm sure Walt Trowbridge will be joining up with the socialists and some of the left-wing radical ex-senators and the farmer laborites and so on." Bill Atterbury guffawed. It was a tremendous, somehow terrifying blast. "Yes, I'm sure they'll join up, all the dirty, sneaking, half-headed, reformist, social fascists like Trowbridge." There are doing the work of the capitalist and working for war against Soviet Russia without even having a sense to know they're doing it and to collect good pay for their crookedness. I admire Trowbridge, snarled Remus. You would. Elfrey rose, almost cordial, and dismissed Remus with, Mr. Jessup, I was brought up in a sound bourgeois household myself, unlike these two roughnecks, and I appreciate what you're trying to do, even if they don't. I imagine that your rejection of us is even firmer than our rejection of you. That's right, Comrade Elfie, but you and this fellow got ants in your bourgeois pants, like your Hugh Johnson would say, chuckled the Russian Mr. Bailey. But I just wonder if Walt Trowbridge won't be chasing out Buzz Windrip while you boys are still arguing about whether Comrade Trotsky was once guilty of saying Mass facing the north. Good day, said Doremus. When he recounted it to Julian 2 days later, and Julian puzzled, I wonder whether you won or they did, Doremus asserted. I don't think anybody won except the ants. Anyway, now I know that the man is not to be saved by black bread alone, but by everything that proceedeth out of the mouth of our Lord our God. Communist, intense and narrow, Yankees tolerant and shallow. No wonder our dictator can keep us separate and all working for him. Even in the 1930s, when it was radiantly believed that movies and the motor car and glossy magazines had ended the provinciality of all the larger American villages, in such communities as Fort Beulah, all the retired businessmen who could not afford to go to Europe, or Florida, or California, such as Doremus, were as aimless as an old dog on Sunday afternoon with the family away. They poked uptown to the shops, the hotel lobbies, the railway station, and the barber shop, and were pleased rather than irritated when they would have to wait a quarter hour for the tri-weekly shave. There were no cafes, as there would have been in continental Europe, and no club save the country club, and that was chiefly a sanctuary for the young people in the evening and the late afternoons. The superior Doremus Jessup, the bookman, was almost as dreary in retirement as banker Crowley would have been. He did pretend to play golf, but he could not see any particular point in stopping a good walk to wallop small balls, and, worse, the links who were now bright with uniforms. And he had enough brass, as no doubt Madary Cole would have, to feel welcome hour on hour in the Hotel Wessex lobby. He stayed in his third-story study and read as long as his eyes would endure it, but he irritably felt Emma's irritation and Mrs. Candy's ire at having a man around the house all day. Yes, he'd get what he could for the house and for what small share of informer stock the government had left him when they had taken it over, and go, well, just go, the Rockies or anywhere that was new. But he realized that Emma did not at all wish to go new places, and realized that Emma, to whose billowy warmth it had been comforting to come home after the office, bored him and was bored by him when he was always there. The only difference was that she did not seem capable of admitting that one might, without actual fiendishness, or any signs of hot-footing it for Reno, be bored by one's faithful spouse. "Why don't you drive out and see Buck or Lorinda?" she suggested. "Don't you ever get a little jealous of my girl, Lorinda?" he said very lightly, because he very heavily wanted to know. She laughed. "You, at your age? As if anybody thought you could be a lover." Well, Lorinda thought so, he raged, and promptly he did drive out and see her, a little easier in his mind about his divided loyalties. Only once did he go back to the informer office. Stobmeyer was not in sight, and it was evident that the real editor was that sly bumpkin, Doc Itchett, who didn't even rise at Doremus's entrance nor listen when Doremus gave his opinion on the new makeup of the rural correspondence pages. That was an apostasy harder to endure than Shad Ledoux's, for Shad had always been rustically certain that Doremus was a fool, almost as bad as real city folks, while Doc Itchett had once appreciated the tight joints and smooth surfaces and sturdy bases of Doremus's craftsmanship. Day on day he waited. So much of a revolution for so many people was nothing but waiting. That is one reason why tourists rarely see anything but contentment in a crushed population. Waiting in its brother death seems so contented. For several days now, in late February, Dreamus had noticed the insurance man. He said he was Mr. Dimmick, a Mr. Dimmick of Albany. He was a gray and tasteless man in gray and dusty and wrinkled clothes, and his pop eyes stared with meaningless fervor. All over town you met him, at the 4 drug stores, at the shoeshine parlor, and he was always droning, "My name is Dimmick, Mr. Dimmick of Albany, New York. I wonder if I can interest you in a wonderful new form of life insurance policy. Wonderful!" But he didn't sound as though he himself thought it was very wonderful. He was a pest. He was always dragging himself into some unwelcoming shop, and yet he seemed to sell very few policies, if any. Not for 2 days did Dreamus perceive that Mr. Dimmick of Albany managed to meet him an astonishing number of times a day. As he came out of the Wessex, he saw Mr. Dimmick leaning against a lamppost, ostentatiously not looking his way, yet 3 minutes later, and 2 blocks away, Mr. Dimmick trailed after him into the Vermont Pool and Tobacco headquarters and listened to Dreamus's conversation with Tom Aiken about the fish hatcheries. Dreamus was suddenly cold. He made it a point to sneak uptown that evening and saw Mr. Dimmick talking to the driver of a Beulah Montpelier bus with an intensity that wasn't in the least gray. Dreamus glared. Mr. Dimmick looked at him with watery eyes, croaked, "Good evening, Mr. Dreamus. I'd like to talk to you about insurance sometime when you get the time," and shuffled away. Later, Dreamus took out and cleaned his revolver, said, "Oh, rats," put it away. He heard a ring as he did so and went downstairs to find Mr. Dimmick sitting on the oak hat rack in the hall, rubbing his hat. "I'd like to talk to you if you ain't too busy," whined Mr. Dimmick. "All right, go in there. Sit down. Anybody hear us?" "No, what of it?" Mr. Dimmick's grayness and lassitude fell away. His voice was sharp. "I think your local corporal's on to me. Gotta hustle. I'm from Walt Trowbridge. You probably guessed I've been watching you all week asking about you. You've got to be Trowbridge and our representative here. Secret war against the corpos, the NU, the New Underground, we call it, like secret underground that got the slaves into Canada before Civil War. 4 divisions. Printing propaganda, distributing it, collecting it and exchanging information about corpo outrages, smuggling suspects into Canada or Mexico. Of course, you don't know one thing about me. I may be a corpo spy, but look over these credentials and telephone your friend Mr. Sampson on the Burlington Paper Company. God's sake, be careful. Wire may be tapped. Ask him about me on the grounds you're interested in insurance. He's one of us. You're going to be one of us. Now phone." Dreamus telephoned to Sampson. "Say, Ed, is a fellow named Dimmick, kind of a weedy-looking, pop-eyed fellow, all right? Shall I take his advice on insurance?" "Yes. Works for Walbridge. Sure. You can ride along with him." "I'm riding." End of chapter 25.